Thank you for taking the time to view this presentation, which will focus on the Sustaining Outpatient Services, or SOS Act. We will review information on the legislation, its status, and the materials available for your congressional meetings. At the end of each two-year session of the Congress, any bills that did not become law need to be reintroduced in a new Congress. This provides an opportunity to review the bill text and update it as needed. The SOS Act has not yet been reintroduced in the new Congress, which began in January, but ACVPR is actively working with the bill sponsors to update and reintroduce the legislation. ACVPR will be meeting with the bill sponsors during the day on the Hill. During the last Congress, the House bill was introduced by Congressman Adrian Smith of Pennsylvania and Jim McGovern of Massachusetts. The Senate bill was introduced by Senators John Hoeven of North Dakota and Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota. Your request of congressional members is to be an original co-sponsor of the bill when it is reintroduced. That means you are asking them to sign on in support of the legislation before it is introduced. The purpose of the legislation is to provide an exception to how Medicare pays for certain off-campus hospital outpatient department services. The exception is not specific to PRCR or any other services. Rather, it sets a threshold based on whether payments to physician specialists under the Medicare Physician Fee Schedule are below a set threshold during the previous year. This approach identifies services that are not typically performed in a physician office, like PR or CR services, and exempts them from being paid at an unsustainably lower rate. This will help ensure the current site-neutral policies do not unintentionally restrict patient access to these critical services. In your participant folder, you'll have the chart appearing on the next two slides showing Medicare payments by specialty for pulmonary rehabilitation and cardiac rehabilitation. Note that all are under the $2 million threshold included in the previously introduced legislation. You may notice that a few specialties are getting closer to that $2 million threshold, necessitating an update to the legislation prior to introduction to ensure it will continue to work for PR and CR services in the future. Many staff you meet with will not be familiar with the details of Medicare site of service, and if they are familiar with it, they may not know the unintended consequences for pulmonary or cardiac rehab. The issue brief will provide more detail, but in general, Medicare payment often differs based on the location of the service. Services provided in a physician office are paid differently from services provided in a hospital outpatient department. The latter includes a claim associated with delivering care in a facility. This differential payment was of concern to Congress and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, since it created an incentive for some to try to game the system. Congress included a provision in the Bipartisan Budget Act to address these concerns. It's known as Section 603, Treatment of Off-Campus Outpatient Departments of a Provider. The law specifies what happens if an existing off-campus service moves to a new location, what happens if a hospital opens a new hospital outpatient service, and grandfathered existing off-campus hospital outpatient department services. This change in law was directed at services that were primarily office-based. However, PR and CR services are not typically performed in a physician office. As a result, hospitals are not purchasing PR or CR practices to benefit from higher reimbursement, the issue that Congress sought to address. This policy has had the unintended consequence of limiting patient access to PR and CR services, as it has become more difficult for a hospital to expand or relocate services to be closer to more Medicare beneficiaries. This is especially concerning due to the current shortages of cardiac and pulmonary rehabilitation programs nationwide and the devastating impact that pulmonary and cardiac conditions have on Medicare beneficiaries. Members of Congress have recognized the importance of ensuring patient access to services. You will have copies of letters sent by House members and by senators to CMS in response to the Outpatient Prospective Payment Services proposed rule. A couple of quotes from the letters are highlighted on the slide and are included in the issue brief that you leave with offices. Before your meetings, you'll want to know whether the office you are meeting with previously supported the SOS Act. As mentioned earlier, the bill has not yet been introduced this Congress, but AACVPR is working with the bill sponsors to update the legislation. Your request is to ask your senators and representative to consider being an original co-sponsor when the bill is reintroduced. That means that they would agree to co-sponsor the legislation and be included as a supporter at introduction. And they can, of course, also co-sponsor the bill after introduction. You can use this chart to identify who supported the SOS Act last Congress. The column on the far right is related to the SOS Act and is split into two parts. The left side shows which senators and representatives co-sponsored the SOS Act last Congress. In some cases, the chart will note if a member of Congress supported the bill in the 117th Congress, but did not co-sponsor the bill last Congress, the 118th Congress. You'll see that noted in red. Don't assume that offices will remember whether they previously co-sponsored the bill. Staff may have changed, or just by the sheer volume of bills, they may not remember. Either way, you can thank them for their previous support of the legislation and ask for their support again this Congress. The right side of the column identifies members of Congress who signed the House and Senate letters to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services that expressed concerns for the negative consequences the hospital outpatient department rule would create for Medicare beneficiaries. If a member of Congress previously signed the letter to CMS, you can thank them for recognizing the barrier this rule creates for access to care, and then explain that the SOS Act would address this barrier in the case of services like cardiac rehabilitation or pulmonary rehabilitation that typically are not provided in physician offices. Your expertise, personal experience, and materials tell the story of why this legislation is needed. Think of your stories in advance. Do you have a patient that needs to travel a great distance for PR or CR services? Do you know of a program that would like to expand services or open a new location but cannot because of the current law restrictions? Stories are an effective tool to explain the problem we're trying to solve. All politics are local, and understanding how these policies impact people in the state is important to share. Again, if you get a question and don't know the answer, let them know someone will get back to them, and then be in touch with AACVPR to let them know what follow-up is needed. Finally, at the end of your meeting, please remember to restate your ask, remind them why you were there, to request that they sign on as an original co-sponsor of this legislation to improve patient access to cardiac and pulmonary rehabilitation services. Follow-up is important. Therefore, at some point after your meetings, please take a minute to complete the feedback form. You'll have a printed form in your folder, or you can fill it out with your device using the QR code, which will also be on the form. It's important that AACVPR knows what follow-up is needed with congressional offices after your meetings. For example, if someone says they'll co-sponsor the SOS Act, AACVPR can follow up. It's also important to let AACVPR know if questions come up in your meetings that require response. And of course, once we have updated legislative text available, AACVPR will want to share the SOS Act with the offices you met with. Thank you for taking the time to review this legislation in advance of your congressional meetings. If you have any questions, please email advocacy@aacvpr.org.